Let's see. So we're experimenting with this live stream on, um, yep, and I see it there. So I think we are live.
Oh yeah, I
So
see you.
if you're watching us live, if you're watching the recording, just bear with us. We've never live streamed from Zoom to YouTube, which is what we're doing. So before we were live streaming from Zoom to Facebook, and now we are going to try to prioritize our YouTube channel. And if you're watching the recording, this just bear with us. Pre-scheduled. We've never live streamed okay. From Zoom and now to... it's playing on my phone, so I know it's working. So welcome to our live debrief of the third episode of the first season of the Seven Sisters podcast about interpreters, which is called Not Quite Magic. And this episode, I interviewed Melissa Mann, who's a conference interpreter. She's a voiceover talent, a voiceover artist, and a translator. She's based in Sao Paulo, Brazil, and her languages are English, Spanish, and Portuguese. And it's the first season of the podcast, so we talked about remote interpreting. As always, the interviews are focused on the interpreter. My intent with this podcast is to profile working interpreters, kind of boots on the ground interpreters, and really give them that space and that visibility that a lot of us don't have. And then we have a theme each season. And so as we talk about the work that the interviewee does as an interpreter, I weave in some themes there, and they talk about some of those things related to the theme. And the theme this first season is remote interpreting. So the idea with these debriefs is that the three of us at Seven Sisters talk about the episode, talk about the issues that were brought up, give you some resources about things that came up in that interview, food for further thought. And hopefully, as we continue with this, we'll get more live audience and questions from you that are live, and that we can then answer or talk about. And in the future, if you want to join us, that's something that we're open to as well. But we're really just starting this as a way to kind of further the conversation about that initial interview. So let me introduce, or I'll have my two wonderful business partners introduce themselves, just a quick introduction, and then I'll give a little bit of update about the podcast, the coming interviews, and then we'll get into our discussion. So you want to go ahead, Liz?
Yes, thank you. Hi, I'm Liz Essery, one of the three sisters at Seven Sisters Interpreter Training and Consulting. I'm a Spanish healthcare court and conference interpreter based in Houston.
Hey everybody, my name is Laura. I'm based in Guatemala City. I work with English, Spanish, and Portuguese in different capacities, primarily conference and healthcare settings, and also work to train interpreters. And increasingly, we are all working to help better the interpreting services that are delivered, the remote simultaneous interpreting services that are delivered online currently and into the future. Thanks.
And a quick update on the podcast. So we're in the first season. This podcast was started in May of 2020, and we have 3 episodes out. They come out about every 3 to 4 weeks, depending on the schedule. And the next interviewee is going to be Bindia Shah, who is a Hindi interpreter who works out of Massachusetts, and she works in healthcare, and she's been working as a remote interpreter, primarily video remote interpreter, for I think it's been about a year now. And she before that she worked primarily as an on-site healthcare interpreter. And so the interview really talks about this transition that she made pre-COVID, wanting to get work specifically that was remote. And she shares some really nice reasons as to why she really likes the remote work, and she's had quite interesting experiences. as a remote interpreter in a language of lesser diffusion. So I look forward to that one. I'm going to edit it and post it, and we'll have, as always, a live debrief as well. That right now is scheduled to come out on the 26th of August. So I believe that's in 2 weeks. And we also are behind with the transcripts of our podcast. So that's something that I'm also resolving so that very soon anyone can accompany the podcast with a transcript as well. So I apologize for those of you that have needed those, and they'll be out, I'll put it into the previous episodes as well, where all of our podcasts are posted on Simplecast, so that you can see those. Okay, so let's dig into this interview. And Liz is monitoring our social media. She's monitoring, which is today consists of YouTube. I'm not sure if we have anyone following us. Do we, Liz? Okay. So which makes it, somewhat easier. We're just kind of talking into the void for now. But if you are watching this and you can send comments on the YouTube live event itself. So what did I'll start by asking each of you, Liz and Laura, what stuck out for you of this interview? What was it that you felt like was something we should take up in our talk today?
First of all, I love this interview, and I really like Melissa a lot. I met her in a collab last year, I guess it was, in Mexico City, and had the chance for her to listen to me interpret into English and give me feedback. And I just found her to be like a really energetic, positive, and also like with really rigorous standards. And so thank you for doing this interview. I think that the overreaching theme for me in this podcast was just how interpreting and the success of it hinges on so many different things. So she talked a lot about her experience where the conditions were pretty disastrous, but it was okay because she was able to carry it with a good partner. And that I really appreciate that message, and I think it's very, very true, and just was a good reminder that interpreting, and this is true in other places as well, court, healthcare, education, the whole success of it hinges on the group effort. The whole team has to show up for it to work. So that was really something that I loved hearing about through her storytelling and your storytelling, and I think is relevant for interpreters working, conference and outside of conference.
If we're telling Melissa meeting stories, Melissa probably doesn't even remember this, but I first saw Melissa from a distance at a Abraços conference, which is a conference for interpreters and translators in Brazil, probably one of the biggest for both groups. And just noticed her because she looked like maybe a little different than the rest of the Brazilians because she wasn't born in Brazil, that sort of thing. A little bit of profiling, I guess, there, for better or for worse, right? So, and I was shy and I didn't know anyone, and I had just moved to Brazil. And she was sweet and willing to talk to me, and that made a big difference to me right there at the beginning. I thought she was a cool cat. I thought maybe I can be that cool too. We'll see. And since then, yes, she's a very encouraging colleague, and I'm really glad to have met her and been able to collaborate with her, both providing interpreting services or with other projects. One of the main things that also stands out to me, besides this team aspect that is crucial for success, is that Melissa is a really cool example of how there are other routes to the profession, right? I think this sort of like formalized master's degree versus not discussion is always out there, kind of in the ether, and there's no there's no mandate on which route one has to take. But if we think about Melissa and think about she's one who is out there piecing together a lot of different training opportunities. So she's just as committed as anyone else is, if not more, to furthering her skills and her abilities and her understanding. And I think that's a beautiful example. I also love I've met so many people in the profession who their background is, they have the I was there, interpreter didn't show up story. They asked, can you do this? I said no, and got in the booth, and I was hooked. And to be honest, I'm slightly jealous of that narrative. That certainly was not my narrative. But I think I think it would have been exciting and exhilarating and a very kind of loving, innocent entrance into the profession, passion inspiring interest into the profession. And so that's also what I want to tease out when we're looking at those different routes. And just rather than trying to juxtapose which one is better and which ones are plausible and which aren't, just holding them up and noticing that they both have advantages and disadvantages. One of the social media posts that you put out, Liz, I love languages. I love dancing around them. So Elena was asking if Melissa, loves her work. And you can tell she very much does. She is inspired by languages. And I feel like I had that, and I'm going to say it open on air, I had that same amount of joy and love for languages and for playing with them. And I can tell you that though I 100% loved looking back the master's degree program that I did in conference interpreting, it certainly did erode a lot of the passion and freedom and innate inspiration that I felt around languages. And that just might, kind of like cigarettes come with a Surgeon General's warning, maybe master's degrees, because I've heard this, for other fields as well, not just interpreting. It's just that double-edged sword when it comes to someone sitting down and trying to show you with the best of intentions how to do something. There's a danger there. So that was my big takeaway, other routes to the profession and imagining what that might be like and what the advantages and disadvantages could be.
Yeah, that's really interesting what you just said about they should come with a warning, because it reminded me of another analogy that I've made about sports and interpreting, and kind of the preparation that's endurance sports in particular require, and how you don't actually ever do the full you don't actually do ever, I trained for a marathon last year and completed it, and it's 26 miles, and most training programs, most coaches tell you don't actually ever run 26 miles before the marathon. You run 20, 22 only like twice in your whole 18, 20 week training program. You build up to it, and then you're expected to just kind of go that final bit with adrenaline and the sense of like, I'm going to finish this thing. And I've compared it before to interpreting, that first time in the booth, or probably in any setting really, where you do all this preparation, you get your training, you read about it, you prepare in all the ways, but you've never quite done it. You've never quite done the real thing. As much as you can get with deliberate practice, as much as you can get with peer feedback. It's not the same as an actual event, right? With a paying client, or even a non-paying client, but someone who needs you. And yet that's the leap that one has to take, right? So it's a nice analogy. And the one that you just mentioned reminded me of one of the big downsides that I felt when I trained for longer triathlons, in that I've always loved riding my bike and cycling, And doing that kind of training where I had to ride for 4 to 5 hours on my bike and keep up my heart rate and watch my heart rate. And it wasn't just like, oh, it's a beautiful day, let's go for a ride. I had to have I was training for my nutrition. You train for what you're going to drink. And it was awful. I hated it. And I hated cycling. And it really eroded, as you put it, the joy and the passion, and the inspiration and the freedom, all four things that you mentioned about cycling for me. Um, and so that's really interesting. And perhaps it's an interesting thought for programs to adapt to that to a certain extent if they're seeing a lot of experienced people who want the degree. And I think there's a lot to be said for having a degree and for kind of requiring some more formal training for some of the settings. Or I shouldn't say you want formal training, but a degree for some of the settings, and yet adapting it in a way that perhaps doesn't erode it as much, or that you can still honor some of that and their experience, a less top-down training, or whatever it would be, just taking more from the student's experience in the professional world. And I know that it's very interesting for you to hear that from you, because my experience with a master's degree was in translation studies, so it's totally different. And none of the people there were practicing professionals, but all the MCIs, that's what they are. They are practicing professionals. So yeah, that is interesting. And we hear it so often, and yet as everyone, well, as the years go by and younger people are starting out, and I think that is a trend that we're seeing, that new interpreters are younger and younger. That's going to change, I think, right? Because more people are starting with the education. You can't get in to a lot of the settings before some kind of training, like you used to. like at least I did. Yeah. So you're saying, Laura, that you didn't. You did the training first.
For conference interpreting, then I have the opposite experience, and this is what I appreciate about what Melissa was saying. And she was saying this was her experience and her life circumstances and her way in, and that also had its, she said explicitly, that had its problems and its limitations. And so, the answer might not be getting a master's degree, and the answer might not be not getting a master's degree. This gets at probably a larger conversation about education, educational access, and education formats that we're all having, in any field for any age right now. But at the end of the day, I really appreciated hearing her experience.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. It's not there is no one answer. And as we explore, what education is going to look like and the changes that are coming, because I think it's going to really change. I think higher education is more, as many people are saying, the new normal. It's not going back to normal. There's a lot that we're going to adapt, which is really good. There were already some excellent online programs, and the ones that were not can learn how to deliver really good online content, and then open up the opportunities, even more. I mean, that creates more access to education and to those opportunities.
This is why, it's unfortunate that we don't have all of the hours in the world to become really good at interpreting, at languages, at interpreting, at training. And I'm just so glad that there are teachers who are wholly dedicated to teachers who are putting their minds to solving what seems to me like a central conundrum: is how do you create excellence without killing joy? And so, yeah, stay tuned, everyone, or maybe send us links, everyone, that has, the one paragraph answer. And then I think she also points to what I thought, this is a larger discussion about access to training programs, particularly in the Americas, in all settings. In Europe, there's a plethora of training programs. In the Americas, more and more, but still less. And I like that, okay, it's like first you have to have the languages, right? Then you have to apply and even get into the program. Then you have to be able to afford it. Then you have to be able to afford living in the place where the program is. Then you have to be able to afford leaving, and this is what Melissa pointed out, particularly for practicing interpreters, freelance interpreters, which is the majority of us in the Americas, leaving, putting your client base in the balance. Will they be there when you get back and done with your master's degree? I don't know. And so, that's a significant number of barriers. So yes, let's all keep thinking and rethinking.
So what else came up for you, or what else do you want to talk about in terms of what this interview brought up for you? Go ahead.
Go ahead, Elena. Finish the thought before I launch into my.
No, it was not a good thought. It was a good thought, but it wasn't relevant. Go ahead.
I really loved the way Melissa talked about her more recent experience with remote interpreting, where, she's obviously had been experienced in remote interpreting pre-pandemic, but I loved how she pointed out that now what has changed with remote interpreting, I think, is that everyone is remote, right? Rather than just an on-site event with the interpreters being remote, and how that creates this sense of camaraderie and teamwork. Like, we all want this to work. And I think it was left unsaid, but I think is obvious that some non-interpreters are then sensitized in a way to the interpreter's experience in terms of the need for good audio and what it really takes to sound and look good online and deliver a message effectively online. I think that more non-interpreters are certainly thinking about those things than before. And I think that has been my experience too. I partnered with Laura on several events since the pandemic began. And that, I think that was my experience too, where you have this group of people who they want interpreter services online. In more than one case, it was events that had been happening regularly for years, and now that everyone is online, all of a sudden we have access to bring in interpreter services. And so in some ways it creates a broader access in terms of interpreter services. And the people were excited about it, and so it was this whole thing, and the interpreters we were very visible, we were very hands-on, and I love to hear that she also has had that positive experience, very, very positive aspect of everyone being remote. I think is that we get more chances to collaborate with clients now and make it work. I think interpreters are really good at just kind of taking some pieces and putting them together and making it work. So that was something that I really appreciated about that episode.
Yeah, and I think that tied into that idea of that technology won't be the end of interpreters, but interpreters who don't adapt to technology. That it'll be the end of the interpreters who don't adapt to technology. The saying that's been going around for quite some years. Because you're right that I think we are very good at figuring out how to make it work and work with the client. But it's those of us that are in that are in the realm of remote interpreting, and I think there's already been a little bit of separation where interpreters who are more, or just less, less versed in technology, or don't have the experience, or haven't been offered, an experience with it, are already a little bit behind because they weren't able to kind of be part of it, and they can't, it's not coming to them, that idea of adapting. So making sure that, again, we're offering, and other people are offering, ways for interpreters to add this skill, to add technology as a skill, because there were a lot of us who did not have to engage with it very much. Who even the idea of using a tablet or a computer in the booth was a newer thing. And, oh, what do you do if there's no Wi-Fi? And I was dependent on this laptop, or my presentation on the laptop. So bringing that along. But Laura, it seemed like you wanted to say something too. I don't want to dominate this conversation.
No worries. No, let's see if I can keep all of these. This inspires so many different things in me. One, thinking about interpreters adapting. Yes. And you know what I would say is, actually, I'm thinking today, not all interpreters have to adapt. Actually, I mean, sure, during the pandemic, you're going to see a downturn in work, and then afterwards, no. And the other thing that occurs to me is, so yeah, just saying not all interpreters have to adapt. And because some interpreters adapt does not necessarily mean a threat to those who don't adapt at this point, right, in evolution. And secondly, I bet there's a couple of things that I want to tease out. I bet a lot of interpreters are feeling, weary of hearing like we have to adapt. And what occurs to me is, for example, people who work regularly for institutions or on site, they are adapting all the darn time to technology. Maybe not in the same way that we think about it, but adapting to new headsets, new consoles, new regular equipment, new environments, new needs. And so I can't think of a more adaptable group of people. In fact, it's surprising, actually. And maybe it's because we spend all of our professional lives being so adaptable that sometimes in our own community, we reach our limits of being adaptable, right? And it's like, no, I just cannot adapt anymore. Do not ask me to adapt. And the other thing that occurred to me is, it might be helpful for us to all think about, as far as different levels of technological fluency, the same as we think about our languages. It occurred to me that, for example, I'm almost like a double A in technology, right? So that was I grew up a double A in technology and whatever else. And for other people, technology is an acquired B language, and so there's a really awkward learning period where it's like, I know I know I'm supposed to know this already, but I don't know this already, and I'm still figuring out how to even, like, nothing about this is intuitive, right? It's those first, for us B language acquirers, it's those first moments in a B language where you're like, it's like all weirdly automated, and you don't have all of the tools, and you go to the wrong place. You're trying to say one thing and you recur to the wrong tools, and so I think that's very. So I feel I'm not a technology genius by any means, but I do have an amount of comfort with it because it is in some ways a language that I acquired slowly, rather than having to like sit down and learn it that the way that I did with my foreign languages. I'll stop there.
And to that, I love that, thinking of our tech fluency as our
As a B language.
part of our language friends. I'm definitely a tech B. and to that, it just, I go back again to when you have strong partners, and when you know who to ask, and when you have people who respond kindly when you have to say, this doesn't make sense to me, I need help with this. I'm looking at you too, Laura and Elena. That really, that is necessary to help. I mean, we have to carry each other like that, right?
Yeah, those are great ways to put it, and the idea of tech fluency also led me to think of continuing education, right? So if you're talking about it as a second language, something that you acquire later, or something that you add on to the skills that you already have, it's also something that you have to cultivate, and even whether it's a or a B language, right, with ongoing updating, and which ties back to that first point you made, Laura, about how adaptable interpreters are, right? And it's the staff interpreters, but it's also freelancers, because freelancers have to adapt to, constantly changing settings, the types of clients, what the clients know and don't know about, what's needed. I'm in any location, new booth mates, whereas staff interpreters, especially in Europe, I imagine it is much more established, and you kind of probably work with a smaller group of people. Um, yeah, and you're right, and I think that approach is so much nicer. Instead of telling these highly adaptable creatures you have to adapt, it's like, no, you're already adapting. This is just a new, this is on that same continuum. And that's actually when I first started um, thinking about remote interpreting and writing about it, because I wrote a couple of things for the ATA, and the thinking seemed to be that remote interpreting was like this new thing, and you know it's like, it's not, right? It's telephone interpreting is remote interpreting, and it's not that new. And even, I think someone was even arguing, I think I saw this written somewhere, that the first time that you had equipment that was already remote, in the sense of how it carries the sound, because now you're relying on something else other than just the your ears to carry the sound, right? Or your voice to carry the sound, and to then your ears to then pick it up. So the first time that equipment was used was already a little bit of a step in remote interpreting. And things change, and as Liz said, open up possibilities, right? Because if you're only doing whispered, if you need to do simultaneous, you can only really do that with a couple of people. If you're doing it without equipment, that just doesn't work.
There's a couple of things that I didn't want to let escape. One is I've been searching for the right communication tools with clients to talk about why sound is important in the remote environment, that actually speak to them, that aren't just like my language that I'm trying to ask them to understand. And I love that Melissa, I think, really hit the nail on the head by saying, like, just I mean, it's as simple as like bad sound is stressful. And I think those are words that clients can understand, and the people we work with. And I might add on to that, like, bad sound is stressful, even if we're not aware that that's what it is, because I think that's the issue. We as interpreters are highly aware and can diagnose that problem, but I think it's the general consumers of people in virtual settings who they know that it's tiring, they know that it's more tense, and they're not exactly sure how to put their finger on why. So I thought that was really adept. And that leads me, as you were saying, this is not new, Elena. It's not new in particularly in other settings such as healthcare and court, who have been doing over the phone, and other types of, and even video remote interpreting for a while now. And so for interpreters who work in those settings, I wonder if either one of you might be able to further tease out why Melissa is, so these interpreters have been Melissa's like, you got to have the basics. You got to have visuals. You got to have a teammate that you can rely on. And I can imagine there are maybe healthcare over the phone interpreters listening, or other VRI interpreters who are like, what do you mean? Like, I interpret all day long with no visuals, and what's a booth mate? Like, I don't have a partner. what that disconnect in what some interpreters are like, these are basics, and other interpreters are like, but I do this and I do it well a lot of the time. What's happening with that gap?
Is that a question to be answered? Like right now?
Yes. Tell me the answer.
I don't think I have the answer, but I have some thoughts. And I love that question because I've also thought the very same thing. Why do different interpreters have such deeply different needs? And I think that, when I think, Laura, of, for example, remote simultaneous conference interpreting versus, let's say, over the phone consecutive healthcare interpreting, both with their own challenges. I think that in the conference setting, and this is, up for debate, and of course depends on the people you're working with, but generally you can get enough information in advance to have, you've got some kind of preparation. Whereas you don't necessarily have that in healthcare, but you have access to the people speaking in a way that you don't in an RSI scenario. So that, and you can ask for people to help you up front, right? So you could ask for the doctor, you could say, if there's a visual cue you think I'm missing, of course, that's if they're on site, or, if there's some kind of anything that you can describe to me, and then I can interpret that. So I think that there's a more, like, in the actual moment of interpreting, there's more of a collaborative effort happening with, like, OPI healthcare, for example, that can compensate for, the lack of a partner, the lack of an interpreting partner, and the lack of the visual, and the lack of the preparation. So that's what I think is part of the answer.
Yeah, that is a tough question to tackle, but I think you're right. I think healthcare is more collaborative. And the old saying of the communication is collaborative. The goal, everyone has the same goal. All the speakers, in simple terms, want the patient to get better. And so, which is different. I mean, different from conference or business meetings, can be very different. And it's two-way conversation, right? So there is already more dialogue between the speakers to begin with. And if you think about communication theory, people are creating meaning as they talk when they're in a dialogue. It's different than a one-way presentation, which a lot of conference interpreting is one way. And so that might have something to do with it, because they're creating meaning, and the interpreter is kind of in that mix. That's what people talk about now, that it's really a triad when you're doing that kind of communication, because of that aspect of creating meaning as you talk and as you see the extra linguistic signs and the tone of the voice and the look on the face. And then you also think about court, because court interpreting, as medical interpreting, as healthcare interpreting, is a little bit more scripted. It is a mix, and there's definitely a mix. We never really know what the patient's going to say, but we know pretty much how the appointment's going to go. If it's a general, if it's this type of appointment, this is what's going to happen. And the same thing in court, right? In a courtroom setting, which there are some courtroom settings that have remote interpreters, and I've had them for quite some time, without visuals and without team members, as far as I understand. And an arraignment, how an arraignment's going to go. There's several things. A trial would be a little bit different. And then I started thinking about a deposition, which was like, a deposition, I feel, doesn't have that kind of collaboration. I think you're onto something with that idea. And there is less. The interpreter is definitely the interpreter can clarify, but it's much more limited, and the meaning is being created just like it always is in a dialogue. But the lawyers in particular are trying to parse that as much as they can to get what they want out of it, right? Which usually in a deposition is they want to get something incriminating so on the person who's speaking so that they can do good by their client. Again, very simplistic terms, but so that might be something to do with it, because I think a deposition over the phone without any visuals would be quite difficult. Yeah.
I kind of wanted to explore it because I imagine that maybe for someone working in conference interpreting to then maybe go talk with a healthcare interpreter or a court interpreter and not know a lot about the setting that they're working in and the particularities of that might just come to the conclusion that, like, man, why do these healthcare interpreters and court interpreters accept, in my mind, what are lousy conditions, right? And I think that's the really simplistic interpretation. Not that healthcare interpreters and court interpreters couldn't benefit, from, wouldn't enjoy working with a partner, for example, for longer, or having the visual when possible. But I did want to hear from you all to try to get our minds around. That it's see if we could pull some stuff out and not flatten it down to they accept sucky working conditions and we don't. And Liz, I think you're on the right track. That's a really interesting way to think about it, in that if I think about the healthcare setting, really it feels like everyone is bearing part of the responsibility of the communication. So, providers, for example, are taught and they understand that they need to be adaptable in their communication in order to achieve this common goal, right? And patients who are really wanting the doctor to understand are going to try to express things in a way in which they are understood. And the fact that, there's not only the ability, but almost an onus to make sure that we're using our skills to intervene and make sure communication, or not make sure communication, but just try to alert all the parties to if communication might be going off track. And then I think about conference interpreters, and what happens there in those environments is you have a client who's like, or a speaker, for example, who's like, my responsibility is to give my presentation. Like, I got enough to worry about. I got to give my presentation, and the audience is there and they're like, my responsibility is to learn everything I can at this conference. Like, I'm not interested in being, I'm not even interested in making sure, dear interpreter, that you have the materials ahead of time. And so really in conference interpreting, the model is that conference interpreter, you're hired to take care of this piece of communication. Get it done. Don't check in with me, get it done. Of course you have clients who are a little more collaborative, but I think that really also points to it's the fact that it's the simultaneous mode, and the fact that really in the conference there's a lot more put on maybe that one figure of the interpreter. And I wanted to mention, Liz, you were talking about events that we had done. I wanted to take care of the people who might be listening and being like, why are they doing remote events? I'm not doing remote events. What am I doing wrong, right? And Melissa said it best, which was, so I put together this studio and ta-da. And then I realized I have to go out and tell people. And so I get this question a lot, and you're not, dear listener, doing anything wrong any more than the rest of us. We're all trying to figure this out. But the fact is, there aren't organized systems of matching, prepared remote interpreters with clients at this point. There's no, besides String and Can, to my knowledge, there's no, company out there who's like, we are dedicated 100% to remote simultaneous interpreting. And so, and we as a company are going and having to do the same thing that Melissa is doing, and anyone else who's actually interested in acquiring the B language of remote interpreting, which is to find ways to go out and tell people. And so I'd love anyone who's listening to this later to put in the chat ways that strategies that you've used to make that happen. I mean, I'm happy to share kind of things that I've thought about and done. One is just making sure you're in touch with the clients that you've worked for in the past on site and letting them know that this is even a possibility, and that you're trained and equipped and prepared to provide the services for them. I don't know if Liz and Elena, you have any other suggestions as far as for people who are interested and equipped for remote simultaneous interpreting, how they would go about finding clients?
I mean, I think that letting your people you've worked with on site, letting them know that you can provide the service online is it's a great start. And that includes agencies, I think, who would hire you as a subcontractor. I've gotten some work that way. And being visible, letting people in interpreting know that you're ready to do some RSI work, and also outside of interpreting as well. I love this story that I will very quickly tell. That I tweeted something about RSI, about doing RSI pre-pandemic, and someone a non-interpreter in my Twitter circle saw it, and then when someone in the NGO she worked for came to her and said, "Who can do this?" she thought of me. and we got a ton of work from that. And so I think just, it doesn't even have to be like aggressive, hard, I can do RSI. I think just talking about it as best we can, and you have to like it, just being visible.
Yeah, that's a great point. Is the it's not, I wouldn't even call it a soft sell. It's just keeping in mind that nowadays at all times on your channels, you're sending a message about what you do. And so, if anything that you're publishing, you're sending a message about yourself, right? And what you do. And it probably gets into what branding experts talk about. You want to make it clear and simple and obvious to non-experts, which is my whole, my thing with the hashtag for remote interpreting, even the hashtag for interpreting and for translation, the 1NT and the XL8, and then the remote, which is R1NT. I'm not a big fan of those hashtags because they reach only the people that already know about it. It's similar to this idea of, I don't think it's the end of the world to, and I know this is somewhat controversial. I know people don't agree with this as a majority, but that it's not the end of the world to sometimes introduce yourself as a translator when you do interpreting work, because that's what everyone's going to understand. And so when I'm talking to somebody, I don't know, the person who's hopefully going to come install AC in my home office, because I am really having a hard time in the heat here in the northeast of the United States in the summer. And, if they ask, not that any of them have, but if they were to ask what I do, or if I'm describing what I do, that's the word I usually start with, is translator. I say, oh, I'm a translator. I work with spoken word as a translator, as an interpreter. But that kind of branding, where you're doing it for anyone watching you, because it's so universal now.
Oh man, I have a lovely tie-in here. So I participated, shout out, in a really well organized and really fun new practice group, online practice group, which involves remote simultaneous interpreting and which happens to be um, one of the leadership, members of the leadership happens to be Melissa Mann, right? And this practice group is called Ameribox, and I had the pleasure of providing relay from Spanish into English for one of the speeches last Saturday on their dry run, and an interpreter named Hedwig, who is based in Peru. Did I get that name right? In any case, sorry if I did not, because the presentation was really great, and the title of her presentation was basically interpreters, experts in communication, but bad communicators, right? And that was her point. She was really reconsidering the ways that she communicates about what she does, and I thought it was a really enlightening presentation. And that, before the top of the hour, we probably don't have time to go very far down this rabbit hole, but I'm going to shift it a little bit to talk a little bit more about working conditions, right? Because that came up between you and Melissa, and whatever. We do need to have a whole debrief around this idea of a gray market and what that means and how we all feel about it and what we're all supposed to do or not do about it. So let's put that definitely out there for more debriefing. But also, I wanted to demystify something that came up, which was about setting rates. And Elena, you mentioned the tables, right? And all I heard in my head was tabelas, because that's exactly what you were. It's a very Portuguese word. But in Brazil, and I'll put the link in the YouTube channel chat. You can go to an organization called Sintra, and there are like reference rates laid out for in different cities for different circumstances, what a standard market rate for interpreters would be, right? So this is like, I mean, I don't have hard. I'm quite sure it's probably illegal and does not exist in the United States, right? Where we have very strict like competition laws and anti-monopoly laws and anti-price fixing laws, and there's the whole lawsuit that happened several years back. But and Melissa said, and I did as well when I lived in Brazil, she was able to use that if needed as kind of like backing for clients, for them to understand, no, this is a legitimate market rate. Of course, people can charge less or more, and most clients, weren't even aware that these reference charts exist. But I'll point out in Guatemala, we also have them as well. It's a different organization, and that also, I think, helps interpreters understand that, when they're scared, as we face some of the challenges maybe that translators were facing several years back, as access to translators went online and global. For example, if you go to the tarifario, the chart for Guatemala, a day rate here in Guatemala, and this is for the organization, this is not a government thing. Like, this is organized by translators and interpreters. And the day rate for interpreters in Guatemala is $250 a day. And I'll note there's a half-day rate available there and an hour rate available in this standardized, supposedly by, I'm not a member of the organization, but it's interpreters and translators themselves that got together and decide, and publish this information. And so I don't know if you all have any other ideas. I did a quick search before we got on, and I'm like, what would U.S. interpreters do to find out about rates? And I know some research has been done, but even just there's many of the statistics. So it's only backwards looking, right? You can only you have data as far as what people are charging, but it's backwards looking, not forward setting. And a lot of the data includes both translators and interpreters, which is not necessarily helpful to either profession if it's all mixed in like that. But actually, ZipRecruiter, they have so much data flowing through them that they have really, and I'll put this in the YouTube chat as well in a moment. They have data about what interpreters make on average hourly and then salary wise, and that's based on basically what what job recruiters are offering, which I think is a great metric for really understanding what the market is willing to pay in certain. And the average hourly rate for interpreters across all settings, according to them, is $30. Seen a little bit less when it's blended in with translators or from other sources. And surprisingly, the average yearly salary for interpreters is something around 60,000.
Yeah, I mean, there's yes, there is so much that can and cannot be said about rates. I think the difference, and I know you know this, with Latin America, I think in general, or at least South America, but Guatemala's in Central. So yeah, Latin America is that the profession of translation, and to a certain extent interpreting, is regulated by the state, right? So you have, because when I was talking about the tables or the charts, and I think she referred to it as the matrix that they have, I was thinking of it from my days of working with the sworn translator, who was also an interpreter, but had never worked as an interpreter. But that's the title that she has, the tradutora juramentada, intérprete, forget what they add after that word. But the sworn translator and interpreter, they if they're doing a sworn translation, right? So if it's needed for anything official, there is a rate that's set, as far as I understand, or at least it was at the time in the state where I was, that rate is set for what the person can charge. And I think maybe that's where that culture of the professional associations then setting rates, or setting kind of an idea of rates, comes from, perhaps. And it's just a very different way of looking at it. Whereas, yeah, in the United States, you can't do anything like that. And
very different labor protections, very different
Yeah.
labor culture in Brazil than in the
Yeah.
United States. Like,
It's completely different.
Yeah.
And I think, okay. Yeah, I will post that to our comments. And I know we are going to wrap this up after an hour today, so we're not going to go longer. Yeah, and I know that, Laura, you wanted to talk about what Melissa and I talked about, well, what I said in terms of professional associations and the market being gray or not. So that's something, again, I think, to urge all of you who are watching this as a recording, to submit into the comments, to start that dialogue with us. You can reach us on our Instagram channel, through Facebook. We also have a Facebook page, LinkedIn, email, all of that. You can, and put in what you think. But since we're doing this in YouTube, we might as well use the YouTube chat. About
I've just
that
added,
topic.
yeah, Liz and I have added some links to YouTube, and I have to rush off, but one serendipitous final comment that I wanted to make is thank you, Melissa, for the podcast recommendation, The Illusionist, because I jumped on to listen to their latest episode, which was about shine theory. And so I thought we could kind of end on a very positive note, because shine theory is the idea. It was just this, it's a language podcast, but it were these two friends who actually coined this themselves and about the process of doing that. But it's basically just working with the ethic of, I don't shine if you don't shine. So that really resonates, and there's a lot of talk about, the lack of culture of interdependence in the United States. And I think this ethic of I don't shine if you don't shine is something that's like helping me recommit to the work that I'm doing right now, in this partnership with the three of us, as a really grounding ethic and kind of north. And hopefully it's a way to also inform the decisions we make as professionals in the field. That's not like an overbearing, like you're supposed to do this because those are the rules and these are the standards, but kind of, as we were talking about education, not a top down, but a ground up. I don't shine if you don't shine. What does that mean to me? And
I like that.
yeah. And so that's what I'm taking with me.
I have two quotes of yours here that I'm gonna pass on to our social media manager. Um, I like that it reminds me of the blue ocean, that concept, but I like it better even than the metaphor of the blue ocean versus the red ocean, where everyone's kind of eating the sharks and they're all eating
So
each other, so the
violent. Yeah,
ocean's
yeah.
red. Because it's collaborative. So we are, yeah. I don't shine if you don't shine. That's a wonderful note to end on. And it is 5:01. So, Liz, do you wanna say some final words before I turn off our live stream?
Just thank you. And I love that. I love the shine theory, rising tide and all that. Thank you for that positive note.
Yeah, thank you, and thank you both. And thank you for those of you watching, and keep the feedback up in terms of what you like about the podcast, about the debriefs, what you don't, what you want to see us do. If you want to be interviewed, or if you have an idea for a great interviewee, send those our way, and we'll see you next time. So I'm just going to see how this works in terms of I'm waiting for it to end here, and maybe this will get recorded and maybe it will not. When I see myself wave, then I'm going to end it. So we'll